My name is Matthew Collins. I work for Hope Not Hate, the anti-racist and anti-fascist organisation. Despite my advancing years, I was once young. In the 1980s, I was a member of the National Front and a host of other far-right organisations, and now I run spies, moles, walk-ins in the far-right in the United Kingdom.
Okay. What would you say it was that actually led to you getting involved in the far-right movements? I mean, obviously nothing like this is binary, everything is incredibly nuanced, but were there any particular reasons that you found yourself getting attracted to that and wanting to be a part of it?
What is the attraction to the far right? I guess it's one of a number of potential or possible answers to a number of questions young people have in their life, and for me, the idea that my life would be infinitely better by making more miserable the lives of others was the attraction. I'm working class. I was brought up on a council estate. I lived in southeast London. There was 4 brothers. There was no father at home. Obviously, we experienced poverty, and I'm not one of those that's going to say I was trapped into the far right, because that would be very dishonest. I was attracted to the far right. For me, they I say this all the time now, but they answered what are complex questions very, very simply, and I found, as a member of the far right, something I hadn't realised I'd been looking for. But yeah, look, for a while it was great. It was the best time of my life. It was brilliant. I belonged to something, and I think that's really important, and we see that in a lot of other people.
Absolutely. And when you say the kind of easy answers to complex questions, is it the sort of answers that would spring to mind as such as, why can't I get a job because of that person with a different skin color down the street? Why can't I, why are me and my friends and my family not living as well as some other people because of
yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And those questions are very, very simple questions, but actually they are complex. Often they take a long time to explain, and some of us find ourselves in the, I think, often unenviable position where we have to take time to understand that these are also actually quite sensitive questions. When you're dealing about poverty, so on, so forth, people's personal poverty, their difficulties in life, they are complex questions. It's very, very complex, particularly with young brains, as mine was, very, very young, underutilized and underdeveloped. But for me, I, growing up in South London, you almost grew up in the shadow of the National Front, because NF was on just about every bloody wall and bridge and shop window. And in fact, by the time I joined the National Front in the mid-1980s, they hardly existed as an organisation. They were down to just a few hundred members. But the sort of shadow it cast, I think, over lives, mine and others, was enormous. Its reach was enormous. Its reach was actually over exaggerated, to be honest with you. Really? But for me, I found a place in there, and that was it.
One thing that I found really interesting in an interview you did in the past was mentioning that there was a kind of appeal to a need or want for a positive male role model, or any kind of male role model, as you said, because obviously your dad wasn't around and stuff. Do you think? Yes. Do you think? I mean, nothing. Again, it's very nuanced and stuff, but if you have a thought on it, do you think that there's a reason why young men tend to be the ones targeted and attracted into these movements rather than young women?
Well, there was a period, not necessarily of young women either, but when the English Defence League grew, we'd never seen so many women involved in the far right. It was extraordinary. Partly, I think that was down to the social media aspect, and also some of the issues that perhaps the EDL tried to take advantage of that were pertinent, I think, to women, particularly to particularly to young women. Going back about the male role model thing, you're quite right. I had exemplary female role models, not just my mother, but grandmother and aunties around her as well, who were that sort of war generation. My mum was a war baby. And so the people who I grew up around my mum, her mother and her aunties, were women who'd lived through the Blitz. And my grandmother worked on the searchlights, shined up at Crystal Palace, shining the really strong, powerful lights on German bombers. But I think probably the one thing I would say looking back at that period is particularly young boys weren't taught the value of female role models. In not just our mothers, but women in general, women in society. I mean, the most powerful woman I had grown up was Margaret Thatcher, and of course we were all taught to hate her. But in terms of the role that women played in our society, we knew very little of it and weren't encouraged to sort of respect it or admire it or look into it, let alone understand it. And that sort of men of my generation, in fact myself too, have been guilty of the most horrendous misogyny, and so because of that, because there was like this absent lead role model in the house, I guess the National Front was appealing because it had lots of sort of father figures. And one thing I learned in the National Front, and one thing I learned growing up, is that of course some male role models or some male lead figures are probably best left out of lives. And some people, and I put in my new book, actually, after studying the sort of men where I lived and where I grew up, particularly when you witness, I guess we witnessed quite a bit of domestic violence on the estate, very, very quickly came to embrace the idea that we were brought up by our mother. But, again, searching for positive or otherwise male role models is generally because we weren't taught to understand and respect and appreciate what women did, bringing up young boys, I guess.
Yeah, and because if you look at, let's say, there's obviously massive links between, let's say, the incel movements online and the far right, and so much of the incel movements, and let's say people like Andrew Tate, so much of what they're doing is like teaching you how to be a man. And
exactly. What sort of man? Yeah, exactly
that. But I know a lot of people, and my siblings included, where we often say that our mother was the best father we ever could have had. And do you think that it is some kind of, is it a toxic masculinity thing? Is it some weird sort of collective collective sort of blind spot in a lot of men's heads that no, if to be a proper man, I need to have a male role model rather than, as you said, neighbors, mothers, aunts, grandparents?
Yeah, I think I've always been a little bit suspicious about toxic masculinity because maybe it's overplayed.
Yeah,
there is a certain sort of male who seems to have a particular view of women, and unfortunately, and it's the sort of view of women you used to get when you're 13 and 14 reading pornography, and then now in society watching pornography, a particular view of women. And these men, these incels, seem to be very, very disturbed and very, very distressed about the idea of independent, intelligent women. And they're not just disturbed by it, they're violently disturbed by it. And of course it says more about them than it does about women. And the lead on into this, and I had discussion about this last night, is that some of the people who lead the far right, some of the far right movements in this country are themselves incels, who spend their, and grown males, people in their 40s who are obsessed by playing online video games. And then they complain that a female character in their online video games, which is all about people who fly and fire bombs out of their backsides, the females in these online video games are too powerful. And these are and by the same respect, as well as living these sort of imaginary lives online, and complaining that these imaginary female characters have too many powers. These are the same people that are complaining that there's a declining white birth rate, and are also encouraging people to go out and try and create babies, none of which they can do at home by hating women and playing computer games. So the potential is, of course, that at least these people won't be breeding in the near future. I think a lot of it's unquestionable is that the attitudes towards women in society, particularly as we see more and more women in positions of authority or in positions of power, or where women are making decisions, there will always be people who reject that. Look, we've had 3 female prime ministers in the United Kingdom. I've not liked any one of them, but it's never been about their gender. But there is a particularly, and it's nasty and it's increasing. And I think it's one of the things that fills a different vacuum. We see different vacuums popping up. Is that increasingly we use the hatred of, we've now injected a hatred of women. Look, I grew up in the far right. There was no one living a very sort of sexy lifestyle, and there wasn't many of these men who walked around all day in duffel coats and hush puppies who were having relationships. Incels are basically angry little boys and angry young men who can't get laid. That's simply what it is. And in that respect, they are the victims of their own hatred. And instead of redressing it somehow, I mean, I don't really know how they could. I'm sure there's plenty of female commentators and academics who could tell you what they could do. But instead of redressing it and understanding it, they just become more and more embittered, more and more nasty, and more violent. And I saw to the point where it made me feel quite unwell at the tail end of National Action and some of the organizations that came after it post 2017. Quite, sort of lower middle class, reasonably well educated, like university educated young men who had such a disturbing hatred of women. And we know that the far right, have always, of course, encouraged violence against people of color or people of different religions that they don't like. And then they added to this sort of dire portfolio of hatred, going from a far right, which I knew, which was about always loving and honoring women as long as they stay at home and only wear skirts and stuff like that, to an absolute hatred, a violent hatred of women. And some of the documents I read, some of the blog posts I read, were encouraging far-right activists to attack women, were encouraging them to use sexual violence as a political weapon, was encouraging rape, was encouraging child sexual abuse, was encouraging child sexual exploitation. And all of these things have become the new ideology. And all of these things are really, really prevalent, of course, on the internet, in these secret chat rooms. And all of these things, of course, we could try much harder to stamp on by parents having a little bit more responsibility about what young men are listening to and what young men are watching. And it's problematic because we do put a lot of pressure on parents. And you and I were talking about, of course, and it sounds like you've got about as many siblings as I do, which is many, is often asking, like single mums or single dads who've got a lot on their plate, just trying to understand and navigate through the difficulties we face in our current economic and social crisis, to then start having to worry further about the dangers of what young people are exposed to online. And yes, definitely parents have a responsibility for that, but we could all do with a little bit more help. And I should plug while doing this that my organization Hope Not Hate does a series of seminars and classes for parents and teachers on this, and we've got guides and all that. And it's actually, as a parent myself, it's who's supposed to know all and everything. Some of the material that our education department produces is startling. But again, by the same respect, would encourage people not to shy away or cower from this. I think if all of us who aren't stuck in dark bedrooms, listening to nonsense on the internet, we have a responsibility. I think it's a wider responsibility as well that we tackle this. I said this the other day. Don't worry about hate on the internet. Is that the internet's vast and wide. There's plenty of space left for us to fill it with either positive or educational or worthwhile things. But it is right. It very, very much the life and world of young men at the moment, I think, is rather turbulent and traumatic. And a lot of young men seem to be struggling to cope with it. No excuse for, of course, where some of them find themselves. But the idea that women are being constantly targeted is not a new one. It's just another one that's not addressed. Again, still not addressed. So, I'm conscious of that. Like I said earlier on, I'm getting older every day, and I'm learning new things every day. I generally don't. I think it's a really, really difficult one to challenge. It means involuntarily celibate. I don't think misogyny is ever going to get anyone laid.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
I mean, that's the truth. But so incels is the latest thing, and of course, the more into it and further into it you go, you end up of course with child sexual exploitation. You end up with Satanists, and in there as well, you end up with Nazis.
Mm-hmm. On your own realization, let's say that you didn't want to be a part of the far right movement anymore. Obviously, in kind of when you've spoken in the past and stuff, the Battle of Welling, is that, I believe, what it was called, what it's been known as, an attack in a library that you said you were shocked by the fact that it was basically old age pensioners and lots of women, some pregnant. Before you kind of get into that, did you have doubts before that, or was that just like, was it a one-off event that made you realize, wow?
No, I never had doubts about. I never had doubts about anything. I plugged my new book, of course, The Walk-In, which I'll show you a copy of.
Absolutely.
But I sort of had a moment of clarity when I was writing it, and it was like, no matter what issue there was that faced us, white working class men, all clubbed in and all stuffed in rooms together. No matter what the issue was, housing, unemployment, hospitals, every discussion we had on it ended with someone needs to get their face smashed in with a hammer. And so I knew that the response generally was, and still is, where possible, meet any challenge with violence, indiscriminate violence. And I was okay with that. I was no angel. But I'd also taken part in violence. That's no secret either. But when you're gripped by what would have been an opportunity, don't forget, fascists are always talking about their freedom of speech and their rights to freedom of speech. The Welling Library was a public meeting held by concerned citizens, and I've said this before, the sort of concerned citizens that would also try and stop a library from closing, or a local school from closing, or a hospital from closing, those sort of people, good people. And they were concerned about a far-right bookshop. Now, the option for people that believed in freedom of speech would have been to go there and argue that case. But instead, they took the opportunity to attack everybody in that meeting. I mean, we're not talking about pushing and shoving, we're talking about extreme violence. Now, in the midst of all that, I looked around at the sort of people who were lying blooded and bruised and terrified. And I thought everything I ever wanted to achieve or needed to achieve, or that was ever going to be better for me, my family, my friends, is laying on the floor here, battered, bruised, and blooded. Because these morons I'm with, my lovable Nazi moron friends, have never tried to stop a school from closing, have never, in fact, tried to close schools, have never tried to keep a library open. In fact, they like to burn books. They've never tried to keep a hospital open, despite the fact they put plenty of people in them. And I just looked around and I just thought, this is not going to change anything. And I realized that actually the attraction for me was just wanting to lift myself out of the sort of poverty, boredom, and the life I was in. And the National Front, the BNP, and the far right had, to a certain extent, lifted boredom. But actually, it had no interest in changing my social or economic conditions. It was just solely about battering and bruising people. And I'd had, prior to that, no objections, of course, to battering and bruising people. But I always tell the truth about that. And so it was that moment, and after that moment, for the first time in my life, I'd ever really began to think properly about the things that I felt, or the emotions that I had, and the angers that I had. And then much later, you go and see a shrink, and they say, you should have come here 30 years ago. But I just thought about them. I just thought, and I just said, oh, this is absolutely bizarre. I just no longer believe in this. And I didn't know what I did believe. And I put my hands up. I may have become an anti-fascist probably on the spot or thereafter, but I wouldn't say I became anti-racist or confident about addressing prejudices or things that confronted me for much, much longer. You see, you have to be an anti-fascist and an anti-racist. Some people think they're both, and some people are both. But you know, sometimes one outweighs the other, so you've got to go in double-fisted on this thing. But it took me a while, because I still held prejudices. But I just, interestingly, I just thought, nothing's going to be addressed or by going around kicking little old ladies in the face.
Yeah, I suppose it takes
you might want to edit that, because that might sound horrendous.
No. I think personally, with something like this, it's there's no. Is there any point in sugarcoating what the reality is of the far right? Do you know what I mean? I mean, I know. I'm not. Look, come here. Not going to try and teach my granny how to suck eggs.
Once you've said fuck on the BBC, once you've said fuck on the BBC, you've done all there is to do.
That's it, exactly. Yeah, it's all gravy from there. But that kind of point of view of I find it really interesting one, and a very honest one, that your decision to kind of become anti-fascist on the spot was more to do with how you realized you didn't want to be a part of the world that you're in anymore, rather than in the environment.
And also driven by, I didn't want to be a part of this world anymore, but I didn't really have anything or anywhere else to go, and I wasn't going to just walk away and leave this. And there is a cure. The cure for fascism is anti-fascism.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. When you did, make that decision to, let's say, to speak to Searchlight and do those things, were you, let's say, despite knowing that it wasn't a scene you wanted to be a part of anymore, and this is like a genuine question here rather than an assumption or anything, because the way I was thinking about it was, let's say, despite the violence and the clear hatred involved in that movement, would it be fair to say that you did actually build up lots of strong, real relationships? And was there... Absolutely. You need to read my new book. No, absolutely. You will read my new book. No, absolutely, because you whether you want to or not, you'll never meet friends like that ever. You're talking about people who would probably kill for you. You're talking about people who had no qualms about violence. There's a lot of people think they've seen violence in their lives, and they probably have. But violence like these people are capable of dishing out indiscriminately. And if you got friends like that, you do think they're probably better friends than they are enemies. Now, of course, they're enemies now. I can't do anything about that. But they were all, and they were also friends. They were my only friends. And then problematically, you think your friends are all a bit dangerous and all a bit mad, and
eventually you sort of think, you realize actually you're not that different to them either. So I did suffer a period of, I guess, not. I went to live in Australia, and some of them I did miss. And 1993, I went to live in Australia, and I had 10 years there. And I think the internet was discovered sometime while I was there, but it didn't filter down to me till much later. So there was no way of keeping touch, keeping an eye on what they were doing or seeing what they're doing. But of course, those people were as well, of course, as eventually became apparent, those people were part of what became the modernization of the BNP. So from stamping on little old ladies' heads in libraries to suddenly wearing suits and going to the electorate, these were the people. So I saw them then. And I thought, the dangers of these people has gone from stamping on heads in libraries to handing out leaflets on council estates. But yes, I had missed them. And in this new life that I've had now, four people, I worked closely with during the period I was betraying them, have since come to see me, come to meet me and have cups of tea and or pass information on their colleagues. So the older I get, the more I think there's fewer and fewer of them without redemption or without something in them that realizes that there's nothing good in it. And I don't now, but I did miss them. I did pine for them. I did, particularly when I was living in Australia and I didn't have the sort of friends that would go around and beat people up for me. I had to do it all myself. It was horrendous. But no, of course. Look, they were genuine friendships. And I would never say that they weren't. Even when I was completely fucking them over, they were still my friends.
Yeah.
God,
I guess that's
a terrible thing to admit.
But I guess that's the kind of, when we say we would die for our friends, most of us don't mean it literally. Do you know what I mean?
No, I know, but then very few people who have got friends that would kill you as well. So
that's true.
You have to balance that up.
Jumping forward to 2017, you were contacted by a member of a far-right organisation, a man named Robbie Mullen, about a plot to kill a Labour MP. Can you explain how that came about, how the contact with you and with Hope Not Hate came about?
Working at Hope Not Hate, my job is to sort of write exposés, undermine, and get people inside the far right to either work for us or pass us information. Some do. Some will just sell us a sexy bit of information for 50 quid, and it's like, bang, there you go. And others will come to us the same way I had 30 years before, in horror and outrage, desperation, and a deep sadness about the situation they were in, or they'd found themselves in. And one such person in 2017 was Robbie Mullen, who was a member of the banned organisation National Action, which was banned in December 2016. He came to us in 2017 and said, "I'm still a member of this group and I can't get out." And I was absolutely delighted. If you're watching The Walk-In on ITV, you'll see I was absolutely delighted. And Robbie and I sort of cultivated a relationship. We met each other. We discussed the group, the organisation. It was a terrorist organisation. People find it hard to believe. It was a terrorist organisation with a warehouse and a gym and an office in Warrington in northwest England. And Robbie was part of it. He was quite senior of it. He wanted out. He couldn't get out. He didn't think he could get out. And I understood that, because one of the things about being in the far right is it tends to lose you friends in the real world. And it tends to, even if you thought you were isolated to start with, wait until you join the far right. And I understood that he had feelings of isolation, and the idea of leaving made him anxious. The idea of staying in part terrified him. And so we worked together. The idea would be that we would do this great expose, because it would have been a great expose. It would have embarrassed everyone. We like nothing more than embarrassing those people in power. It would have been a great embarrassment when we'd have got, pictures, and we'd have published pictures of the gym and all the new leadership at National Action and all the, the photographs of them inside training and all this. But unfortunately, before we could do that, Jack Renshaw met National Action one night and told him he wanted to murder his local MP, and he wanted to murder a policewoman. And fortunately for the MP and the policewoman, our man Robbie Mullen was in that meeting, and he saved their lives. Jack Renshaw, the person who went to the meeting, had been in the BNP, he'd been in the EDL for a bit, a tiny little boy who went to Manchester University, incredibly bright and well-spoken. It was almost admirable, that they could still attract people, who could, basically speak properly. And this boy, Jack Renshaw, he got himself into terrible mess. He'd been trying to encourage young boys on the internet to meet him for sex. He'd been caught doing that. And his way out of it, the way that he felt he could placate his comrades, was going to them saying that he would kill his local MP and the policewoman investigating him for child sexual offences. So it's also quite a little bit sad, I guess. But the good part of the story is that we had Robbie Mullen in the meeting, and he was able to set the alarm and then save Rosie Cooper MP's life.
When you were told about the plot, was it how was the reaction? Was it a mix of, like, obviously disgust and this is horrific what's happening, but then also confidence that all right, this is also an opportunity to really, really fucking hurt these people?
No, didn't think that. The first thing was, fucking hell, right? So took us ages to work out who the MP was, because he kept saying Rosie Cooper, and I'd never heard of Rosie Cooper. But I'd heard of Vivek Cooper, and she'd also been targeted by National Action.
Yeah.
So we had that conversation, and then, of course, I remembered the power of Google, and I said, oh, yes, Rosie Cooper is an MP, and yes, she's Jack Renshaw's local MP. Yeah. The most important thing, most important thing, never been put in this situation before, and you never want to be, was make that MP safe, make that policewoman safe. And the second concern was that this thing that we had going on, this idea that Robbie could have worked for us for a short time, we'd have done the big expose exclusive like we do with groups sometime, and then slowly withdraw our person. That was never going to happen. And I remember one of the very first things I said to Robbie was, this is all over now, and what we have to do now is get you an immunity from prosecution, never mind you disappearing. And he took it reasonably well. But the main thing was, make sure the MP is safe, make sure the policewoman is safe, and then deal with all the other things, because his life was ruined. He was quite, he was a young man, right? He could have gone home from the pub, gone to bed, and woken up on the Tuesday morning to the news that, an MP had been murdered by a bloke he knows. Absolutely nobody knew really who Robbie Mullen was. Nobody really knew who Matthew Hankinson was. Nobody knew who Christopher Lithgow was, or many of the other people that were in the meeting the night it was discussed. So, they probably could have slipped away into anonymity if Renshaw had been more clever. But our thing was that Robbie's life was ruined now. And that, that breaks my heart a little bit. But what can you do?
I wanted to ask you about kind of far-right extremism in the UK, just itself. Do you believe, and I think I have a feeling how you're going to respond, do you believe that British authorities and law enforcement take it as seriously as they should, particularly when it's, let's say, this might be a bit.
Let's just say to that question, they're getting a lot better.
Okay.
They are getting a lot better. It's passed from the greatest respect to the counter-terror police. They don't have time or the resources to try and get a forensic understanding. And the monitoring of the far-right terror threat moved to the security services, and they do sit at home and can sit at home all day reading everything. The police often treat the far-right as like a law and order issue, as often the far-right is. But in terms of terrorism, it needed something more forensic, and it's moved to the security services, and it's getting better. Well, what they've done is they've understood that they're no longer dealing with a gang of drunks like the EDL. No longer are they dealing with the sort of movement like the BNP was 12 years ago. They're dealing with something far different, dare I say, even more sinister. And that needed a forensic examination. It's moved to the security services since 2018. Monitoring the extreme far right has moved to the security services. And whereas the police would treat the extreme far right as a public order issue, for instance, wherever they go, windows are broken and things are damaged, they realized that it needed to be forensically looked at. And so that has moved to the security services. And as of yet, we've had no, what you would call a spectacular terror attack by the extreme far right. Don't doubt for one moment there aren't people out there in the far right who would love a terrorist spectacular. But so far, the security services in this country have been very, very almost confrontational. They've gone for these people when they've had particular documents and when they've expressed particular desires. I got no issue with that at all. By the way, I'm sure some bleeding heart liberal will say it's their right and duty to download bomb making manuals. And so I think that's good in terms of living in a civilized society, that we are protected. People are protected from those. And so, you know, it's not the job of Hope Not Hate to stop murderers. That was coincidental. So I'm happy with that, and we can get back to doing what we do, which is pretty much a job disturbing and disrupting the extreme far right in this country. We don't brag about everything we do, obviously, because obviously we have to keep some people's identities secret, where we get our information from. But I'm fairly certain your average far right idiot knows that when things have gone wrong, it's not just their own idiocy that contributed to it. It's us somewhere poking and prodding, and we're very happy that that's knowledge enough of that.
Yeah. When you say that the far right today is more sinister than in the past, is that because they're kind of coming through the front door in a suit and with a smile, rather than bashing in the back door, you know? I'm sure some of them would like to, but no, look, the far right comes in all guises, and what they wear isn't really important. I think that's just, that was more
that dressage. Doesn't matter what they're wearing. It's what underpins what they say. It's what underpins their motives. When the far right felt that they had electoral opportunities, or when the far right felt they had the opportunity for electoral gains, they were still very, very dangerous. I say this all the time, the danger of the far right isn't necessarily how big it is or how popular it is. It holds an ideology, it holds values which are destructive, which are violent. We spoke about that earlier. It's their values, it's their politics, it's their ideology. It's not about how big they are. Certainly when look, our belief is here at Hope Not Hate. If they want to stand in elections, we welcome them. And we're a registered third party. So we will go, and we do, and we have done traditionally, we have done, that's how we started, was we would go to the electorate, and we would tell the electorate what the far right really believed, or who these candidates really were. And, you know, we gave the balanced opinion, and we gave the honest and truthful facts to the electorate. When the far right don't want to do that, and at the moment they don't, and they haven't for a long time, and I don't think they will for the foreseeable future, is that the only avenues available to them are the avenues which they prefer, which are the avenues of violence, are the avenues of intimidation, are the avenues of excessive criminality. And when they're doing that, we'll be there to undermine them too. It's as simple as that. I don't welcome the far right at the ballot box, because that also has a detrimental effect on community relations. But when they stand for election, when they're when they put their face on their leaflets and they're prepared to go if they are knocking on doors, and we can challenge it and we can see it. I guess that's slightly more comforting for the general public than what we don't see and what they don't see about them.
So, your book and the new ITV show starring Stephen Graham, The Walk-In. First of all, how does it feel to have been portrayed on screen, depicted by one of the greatest living British actors?
I didn't realise just how loved Stephen Graham was, and now I understand how loved Stephen Graham is. It feels different. I don't suppose I would have ever thought I would be portrayed on television in a drama series. I don't think I would have ever wished to have been. However, it's happened, and I'm glad it's hopefully Hope Not Hate, who I work for, gets some recognition, and people want to chuck them a few quid, because what we do is expensive and we don't always get the thanks that we probably deserve. Not that we want any, we're not those sort of people. But if it raises the profile of the organisation and the work we do, then that's good.
Yeah. Do you want to hold up the book there if you've got it to hand?
This is The Walk-In. It's the true story behind the series, but it's not so much just about what we're seeing in the 5-part drama, because but this is just written to accompany it. I think it was catharsis for me, and also it's just full of wry tales from other stupid things I've done.